Welcome to the Smart Business Revolution.
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 You want a revolution?
You say you want a revolution?
Revolution. The revolution.
It's going on right now.
Welcome to The Revolution, the Smart Business Revolution podcast, where we ask today's most successful entrepreneurs to share the tools and strategies they use to build relationships and connections to grow their revenue. Now, your host for The Revolution, John Corcoran.
All right, welcome everyone. John Corcoran here. I'm the co-host of this show, and check out some of our past interviews. Got all kinds of interesting interviews with successful CEOs, founders, and entrepreneurs of all kinds of companies, ranging from Netflix to Kinko's, YPO, EO, Activation Blizzard, Lending Tree, OpenTable, and many more. And I'm also the co-founder of Rise25, where we help connect B2B business owners to their ideal prospects. And my guest here today, Michèle Hecken, she is a executive coach, and she's a longtime seasoned serial entrepreneur, an author, and a speaker. She has 25 years of experience. She started a global company at the ripe old age of 23 years old, which I didn't have my act together at all at 23 years old. So I don't know how you're starting a company at 23. She's been in Entrepreneurs Organization, EO, which is how we connected, for 14 plus years. And she successfully started, scaled, offboarded herself. We're going to be talking a lot about that, what that means, and then sold her multi-million-dollar business, all while raising two daughters as a single mom. And I think as a parent, I'm super impressed with that piece. All of it's impressive, but that's particularly impressive. And of course, this episode brought to you by Rise25, where we help B2B businesses to get clients, referrals, and strategic partnerships with Done For You podcast. You can go to rise25.com to learn more about it. All right, Michèle, such a pleasure to have you here today. And I want to start, I love hearing stories of our childhood and what you were like as a kid. And you have a really interesting background. You grew up in two different cultures. You grew up in Canada and in Germany. In both places, kind of moved back and forth. I think I was really shaped because I moved around a bit as a kid within the United States, but it was always opposite coasts. So we would move from one coast to the other, 3,000 miles away. Not as much of a culture shock as going from Germany to Canada, but it really shaped who I am today. So how did that shape who you are today?
Oh, well, thanks, John. First of all, thanks so much for having me on your show. It's definitely my honor and my pleasure. So how did that shape my being growing up in two different cultures? Well, at the time, I didn't think it was that awesome because I was being pulled away from my friends and a different language. And so I was born in Canada, moved to Germany, moved back and forth. But when I started school in Germany, it was always kind of in the middle of something. So before the end of kindergarten, we moved back to Canada. Then in the middle of grade 2, we moved to Germany. So I always had to adapt really quickly. And I was very lucky because I grew up with both languages, fully immersed in both cultures and fully bilingual with both languages. But at the time in grade 2, I could speak German, I could understand it, but my mom was Canadian. So she spoke to me all the time. My dad was working. I didn't get that much German. So I kind of got thrown in. And while I could speak and understand, I couldn't really write. And I remember in grade 1 in Canada, we didn't learn cursive writing, whereas in Germany, they learned it right away, and I didn't know what to do. So I think how it shaped me, one, is that I became very adaptive and quickly can kind of pivot on the spot because that's what I had to do. It's also made me a lot more aware of how people think in different cultures. And it actually basically had the foundation of me becoming a translator, because all of my life, people told me, oh, you should be an interpreter or you should be a translator because you speak 2 languages. So it kind of set the stage for my future life, if you so will.
Yeah. I don't know if you remember from second grade what the experience was like, but you mentioned moving in the middle of a grade, which I moved in the middle of 5th grade. And I can still remember, being like escorted into this classroom in the middle of a day, which is just so hard. With a room, it's like the record player stops and everyone like looks over at the new kid, Yeah.
And
it can be traumatic and really hard for a kid.
It was. I think at the time, it was really scary because I was also an only child. So when you're an only child, you're really depending on your friends. Because if you don't have friends, guess what? You go home, you're alone. And now you're in a different culture, you're different. You come, you have, maybe not all the words right, or, you don't really know how to connect with anybody, and you do things that but it doesn't fit in that culture. So I remember it being quite lonely at first, and begging my mom to move back to Canada so I could have some friends. Like I remember that. But, one of the gifts you have as an only child, especially if you're moving back and forth, is you have to become naturally good at making friends and making a connection, because your life kind of depends on it.
It does.
So that was another thing that really taught me to, because I was shy as a kid. Like I was quiet, I was shy, I wasn't outgoing, I wanted to be accepted. And so this theme of wanting to fit in has been, kind of prevalent, and I had to master it, because you're fitting in with a group of peers that are not your culture. It's not your first language at that age, and it's a whole different country. So it really did teach me a lot.
Yeah. I've had a lot of guests on this show who have never worked for a paycheck, and you're one of them. You had an experience at age 14, 15, you waitressed at bars and cafes, but it was really entrepreneurial in that you got a % of the revenue that came in. So talk a little bit about what that experience was like and how that shaped you.
Yeah. So my parents worked weekends, to make some extra money. We didn't come from a wealthy family. My parents worked. And so on the weekends they would serve in, a bar, and they'd make lots of extra money. And so I thought, well, what a great way to do that. So when I was 14, I applied to a job in a cafe. And when I say cafe, it was really a full-blown restaurant, and it was 2 levels, and they had these stairs that kind of turned and went up with these big trays, and you had to carry the trays up with coffee cups, and like it was heavy, and you're
that is
kind
hard.
of up and down. I got a good workout. Let me tell you that.
Yeah.
But the model that they used then, I'm not really sure how they do it now. I think it's kind of a bit of a combination, but basically you show up and you're ready to work. You got to bring your own change, and whatever you make in revenue that day, 10% of it is yours, and you get to keep the tips, which in Europe is very different. Like people don't tip 10, 15, 20, 25%, they round up. So if it's 10.55, you might get 11 or 12 euros for marks at the time for it, but it still adds up. So, but there were days where there were no customers, and I would, be there for 5 hours and not make any money. But other days I would go home and I'd have hundreds of dollars in my pocket. So that was the only time I worked for anybody else, but it wasn't a paycheck. It was, you show up, you do a good job, how much effort and what you put into it is what you're going to get out of it. And that mindset really kind of also laid the foundation for becoming an entrepreneur, because it requires discipline.
And did that experience really teach you to sell the appetizers, sell an extra drink, sell dessert afterwards? Did you get good at those sorts of things?
I didn't think about it at the time. I don't think I was self-aware or, kind of mature enough to think that strategically about how I was going to make more money. I just hustled, and I just made sure that I was paying attention. So when I think about it now, when we think about leadership, right, we can go and do this and just kind of go to that table, take the dishes back, bring the new food, put it out to the next table, and we're not paying attention to what's going on anywhere. But I think what I did really well is I was always looking around. Who needs something? What's going on? Is there a new customer? Can I, wipe a table? Can I do something? So I think that was more of an important factor, because I made a lot of money doing that. And I think that was one of the things where it's funny to this day, when I go somewhere and I see servers or bartenders with their heads down for more than a minute, it drives me crazy. I'm like,
yeah, look up. Yeah. I waited tables during high school and college, and I think that everyone should do it at some point. It is such a great skill. It really teaches you so much to balance many things at once, look people in the eye, be open, be honest, have a good conversation, communicate well. It teaches so many different skills.
Exactly. Quick head math too, because we didn't have machines or calculators. I had to add all the bills up manually.
Yeah.
And so I became really, really good at doing math in my head very fast.
Kids these days, they got it so easy. You swipe a card, you don't have to do any math, you don't have to lug around any change.
Nope.
These kids. So there's an interesting story around how you started your company. You're around 23 years old, I believe, and you'd been doing freelance translation in Germany, and you moved back to Canada, and you saw an opportunity with new emerging technology. Talk about that.
I love how you say new emerging technology, because it really was new emerging technology. So the backstory is I had studied at university, I studied languages and law, and I was starting to do translations for a large car manufacturer. Where my husband worked. Like, it wasn't anything glamorous. Like, how did she get this big car company to work with her as a freelancer? My husband worked there. So, but because of being bilingual, because of having had the training, and because I could sell, they sent me so many translations. So I would do them, and then I would fax them back, or I drop them off. And when we decided to move back to Canada, there was a story that I read of this Australian translator who spent her days at the beach till 3 p.m. Then her clients in the US woke up, and then she would go to work and start translating. And I just, this light bulb went off. It's like, we're moving from Germany to Alberta, Canada. There's an 8-hour time difference. So I went and I said to my clients, like, they're like, oh no, you're moving, you know, how are we going to get your translations? And I said, no, this is even better, because there's this new emerging technology called a fax machine. And you can put your translations on there at 5 o'clock when you go home. That's 9 a.m. my time. So I now have all day to translate it, and I will fax it back to you, and you'll have it the next day. And this was at a time when many translators were still typing the translation on a typewriter and putting it in the mail. And by nature, translations are always urgent, and they're always an afterthought, at least at that time, even more so. You put all the time and effort into creating the original document. It's like, oh, right, we need this in English, or in German, or in French, or whatever. So it was what I call, to quote my purple cow. It was a real differentiator. And the company started growing really fast, and I got passed around, and yeah.
Now, at some point, so you get divorced, you're a single mom, you got these young kids, you're running the company, and you kind of have a breaking point where you realize that you were just working too hard, and you say you were being fired in your life by your doctor, your hairdresser, you didn't show up for appointments, and you're being fired by them. You didn't want to be fired by your kids. Talk a little bit about that moment in time.
Yeah. So I was actually still married at the time when I had that epiphany. I wasn't quite a single mom yet. That would have been really, really difficult. But basically what happened is, one of the values that I had, that I said, I'm not going to turn away any clients. So I got passed around, and more work came in. So picture this, it's 8 a.m. I walk into my office. There's like 40 feet of thermal paper fax rolled up on the floor.
Wow.
I don't know if you remember what thermal paper
No,
fax
I mean, the
like,
early fax machines were one long scroll of paper rather than individual sheets, right? Yeah.
That's right. And you can get one with a cutter, but we couldn't afford that. And so I looked at it, and there's like 40 feet, and I'm just starting off, and I'm excited that there's so much work, but at the same time, my heart sinks, because I know it's another 20-hour day. It's another day where we don't have dinner with the family, another day of takeout, another day of not spending time with my kids, quality time anyways. And so, but I didn't have a choice. I was bringing in the money. It was my company. Without me, there was no mortgage. There was no, like, we needed it. I really couldn't walk away. So 2 a.m. rolls around. I'm finally finished. I print everything out, put it on the fax machine, fax it to the client. But of course I have to wait for the confirmation, because fax machines were tricky back then. And so I'm listening to my answering machine. I get these messages from my doctor saying, you missed another appointment. My hairdresser suggests I find a different salon, and my nail tech outright fired me. And I just broke down. I just started to cry. I'm like, I'm really being fired from my own life. I don't have one. And so I went upstairs to, tuck my kids in, as I do, because I hadn't seen them. They were already fast asleep. And I looked and I'm like, oh my God, if I keep doing this throughout my kids' lives, I'm not going to have a relationship with them. They're going to fire me from their lives because I'm not there. And that was that breaking point where I'm like, okay, I want to be a mom and I want to spend time with my kids, but I don't want to be a full-time mom. And I want to have a business and I have a vision to grow it, but I can't sustain 20-hour days. So that was that point where it was like, something has to change. And I wasn't willing to give either of those things up. So when that happens, it really kind of forces us to think differently and think outside the box. So the very next day, and it was a year process, right? It wasn't like, oh, the next day everything changed, but I started looking for translators and I trained them. And so then I was transitioning into more of an editing, proofreading, training, coaching role. And then eventually I trained the translators that I had trained to do the editing and the proofing. And so that took some time, obviously, because I didn't want to lose my clients if the translations weren't at the same level. Yeah. So what happened then I was proofreading 20-hour days. So it wasn't really better, but it was, because I could put more through, right? There's a finite amount of words any one person can translate in the day. And we didn't have all the tools and technology that we have today, but even with that, it's a finite amount of words. Versus with proofreading, I could put through much more. So the business grew while I was doing that. My life wasn't really better, but the business was growing. And so then when I could train people to take over that job, then I was free. And what happened then was really interesting, because then it was like, oh, can you just look at this? My project manager was saying, oh, just look at this translation. And I remember I'm standing there with my gym bag. I'm going to have coffee with my friend after gym, and I'm going to get my nails done. Finally, I am leaving the house. And I get this, can you just proofread these, 3 sentences? It's much quicker if you do it. I have to send blah, blah, blah. And I kind of looked at him and I said, no. And this was my then husband at the time. He was doing project management for me. And he looked at me like I was crazy. It's like, why would you not do this? And I said, because that's not my job anymore. And I left and I felt guilty all day long. But I thought about it. And it's something I bring up when I work with entrepreneurs today. It's like, you're being perceived as what people know of you. So as long as I'm the translator, as long as I'm the proofreader, people will always ask me to do those things. So I came back and really kind of changed my job description. And I reached out to, my translators and everybody. And I said, you know what, I'm chief of revenue now. You are freelancers, you rely on me to get the work in. So I'm going to go and get the work for you. And once I said, I'm not a translator anymore, I'm doing sales and revenue, nobody ever asked me to proofread a translation again, because it just became clear.
That's great that you articulated it that way. What were some of the challenges with once you'd gotten the company to that size and you installed people and you weren't doing the editing? I imagine there were challenges around, hiring, recruiting, getting the right people in place. Talk about that stage of the business.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. And again, I'm still in my mid-20s here, right? So I know nothing about business. I'm really just winging it and making it up day by day. And so what I realized is the more I communicate with everybody and the more I say why I'm doing something, the easier it became. And that kind of stayed with us throughout the organization. The other thing, because I was so clear on my why do I want to offboard myself from my company? My why was just so clear, because even in that moment when I said no, I thought about my girls sleeping and firing me from their lives one day. So what I basically did is I just never went back. So when I was training the translators, I put the systems in place so that they could then train new translators, because eventually I couldn't do it anymore, right? So I had to get them to train new translators. Then I got them to proofread. And so I basically just having that firm, I'm not doing this anymore. So then the challenge, of course, became, as you're growing, I don't know everybody by name anymore. I don't know all the translators anymore. We had to obviously hire a vendor manager to kind of deal with them. And I think the biggest challenge that I didn't really, actually two big challenges. One was I didn't understand how to really formulate and communicate my core values throughout the company. So that was lacking. And that was at a time, I don't know, mid-90s. People didn't really talk about core values much, but it's like, how do I get people to think
there've been a
like
lot
me?
of foundational books that have come out in the last 20 years that have talked about that, but they weren't around then. Yeah.
They weren't around.
Yeah.
And then the other thing is, I remember sitting with my accountant going over the year end, and he's telling me things about my balance sheet, about my P&L. And I'm like, I have no idea what you're talking about. I didn't know how to read a P&L. I didn't know how to read a balance sheet. So that whole operational part was a big challenge for me at the time.
So you reached a point eventually where the company is basically running itself. You have CEO in place for many years, but eventually you reached a point where you decided that you wanted to sell the business. You ended up selling this business actually the year before the pandemic hit in 2019. So you got some amazing spidey sense, and whatever advice you have, I'm going to follow it no matter what it is. But people thought you were crazy when you said you were going to sell the business. So what inspired that? Why, if the company was doing so well, you're getting money from it, why sell it?
Yeah, I got that question a lot, especially because I had offboarded myself early on in the company at a stage where people really thought I was nuts, hiring a COO. Like long before I even hit $1 million, I just wanted somebody to run it. And actually, maybe it was just around $1 million mark. But people were like, why don't you keep the money? And I kept wanting to go back and say, well, you know what? I can always make more money. And at this point, I'm a single mom now. I can't create more time with my kids. So I stuck with that. And then for the sale, so I had been really working less than 10 hours a week for 20 years. And, traveling and seeing clients and really living my best life with my kids. And so why sell it? The revenue is there, the cash flow is there. I'm pulling out all the, perks and
identity too. But a lot of times people kind of identify as, this is my business. I built this business.
Right. I didn't have that so much. I mean, I loved my business and I loved my team. But it wasn't because I wasn't involved in the day-to-day that it wasn't necessarily so much my identity. But why sell if everything is going so well? In this particular case, there was two factors. One was I'd been doing it for 25 years. And one of my mentors who I'd asked, well, how do you know when to sell your company? The thing he said to me is like, you'll know when, consecutively for weeks or months, you're not excited about the next step. You're not thinking about the future, or you're thinking about the future, but you're not excited about it. And, where you have to create more energy to kind of do that. And so that wasn't, I ruminated about it, and it wasn't quite the case. But then there came this point where a couple of things happened. One was GDPR, the German privacy laws, and we had most of our clients in Europe. And for our size of a company, it was a major pain. And so we had to change how we did things, how we kind of managed all the privacy. And because we worked with highly confidential documents, it wasn't just, right? It was a lot. So that was a big challenge. And then the other challenge was technology. Now, I started my business with new technology. We were one of the first people on the internet. I was teaching my clients in Germany how to upload via Z modem so that they could get their files electronically. But at this stage, I knew that if we wanted to stay really competitive over the next 10 years, I needed to put in quite a bit of money to invest. I needed to put in way more energy. It would have been like starting the business over and redefining it. And while that could have been exciting, it wasn't exciting for me. And so I'm like, okay, I think there's a real opportunity if I sell to the right buyer, that the company will continue to exist and grow, which it did, and it still does, with the power of technology behind it. So for example, machine translations tailored to certain clients, like it takes a lot of time and energy to do that. And I just took my mentor's advice. And one day I just like, no, I don't want to do that, but I don't want to throw this away because it's an amazing business with amazing people. And if I half do it without a lot of passion, I might ruin a really good thing.
And you now do speaking and executive coaching. Were you drawn to that at that point, or is that something that came later?
You know, I kind of always had the vision that I would write a book and that I would be an executive coach, but I really didn't know what that entailed at that point. So I took kind of almost a year off, and then I started writing my book, and through writing my book and kind of sharing my experience, I kind of, with my coach, discovered what my superpower is, what my secret sauce was to living a life where I made a lot of money and I didn't work very much, and I had a great life with my kids. So as we're writing this book, it kind of floated to the surface, and it just manifested even more that I wanted to be a coach. But I had time. I wasn't in a hurry. I had an all cash deal. I didn't have an earnout. I had nothing to do with the company anymore. So I wasn't like with a gun to my head to create something. So I went and took my executive coaching certification on the recommendation of my coach, which I didn't want to do. I'm like, I'm an entrepreneur. I don't need to go to school for this. I've got this. Like, my clients are not going to care if I have a coaching certification. And you know what? It's true. They don't. Nobody's ever asked me about it, but I learned so much during that course that, again, it just manifested that this is what I want to do.
Yeah.
And by the way, I do have another business idea that I will launch eventually, but
of course, you're an entrepreneur. Right? Of course you have another. You have probably 10 of them. Yeah. And I also love that. So you kind of own this word offboarding, but you got a little bit of pushback when you started to embrace that term. For me, it really resonates. I'm probably your target market, right? Busy entrepreneur, too busy, young kids, want to offboard myself from things, but you got a little bit of pushback initially from the term. So talk about that. Yeah.
So I kind of struggled naming the baby, if you so will, right? Because we're always told we need to work on our business. And we all drink the Kool-Aid, especially in the old YPO, and it's delicious Kool-Aid, and we should be drinking it. It probably has way more vitamins in it than we give it credit for. It's amazing. We should be working on, we do want to be working on our business, but nobody tells us how to do it. So what we hear all the time is delegate, delegate, delegate. And I actually say that we need to stop delegating completely, because that doesn't give ownership. So what is offboarding and what does it mean? And why did I get pushback? So when I first mentioned it to my coach, it's like, I'm going to call this process of getting out of your company so that your company can scale and grow. Because let's face it, when we start another company, typically the first one does better if it's established enough to have, you know, if you've pushed the flywheel enough, to quote Jim Collins, it will run. And there comes a point where it will grow faster without you meddling into it. Right. And so how do I name that? Do I say, okay, work on your business, but don't delegate? Well, like, yeah. And then I talked to actually a friend of mine. I can't even say that this is necessarily, it's a joint brainchild, a really friend of mine, another EOer, Connor Neal, who's in Barcelona. And we were chatting and he actually said, yeah, you're offboarding yourself. Just casually in context. I'm like, wait, what did you just say? And he's like, yeah. And I'm like, can I have that word? He's like, oh yeah, it's all yours. I'm like, oh my goodness, this is the perfect word. So I went back to my coach and I said, I've got this. I'm going to call it offboarding yourself. And she's like, what? What? That's so negative. We offboard people that we're firing. It's a, a euphemism for firing somebody. Why would you make that your big thing? And I'm like, I don't know. I just really like it. And yeah, basically you are firing yourself from the jobs that you shouldn't be doing, right? So you're looking at, so what is offboarding versus delegating? Delegating is taking a task and giving it to somebody else. And it feels great because you have it off of your desk and you don't have to do it. So I have this temporary taste of freedom. And then you do it again and again and again. Except eventually you have to try and remember, who did you give what to? What is the deadline? You have to stay on top and you still own it. So you're still responsible for it. So it actually pulls you more into the business because then you start micromanaging. Did you do this? How far are you? Do you need help? Blah, 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 because you own it. Offboarding is taking the responsibilities, looking at what is on your plate, what value it has to the company and the value of you doing it, what you love doing and what you loathe doing, and how much time you spend on it. And when you do that, you get a really clear picture and you can take an entire responsibility and offboard it to somebody else. And that creates freedom to allow you to focus on what you're really best at. And it sets the precedent for other people in your company to start working at what they're best at. So it's kind of a perpetual thing. And so when she said, don't do offboarding, I'm like, yeah, no, but you are firing yourself from certain aspects of your role and you're redefining your job description. Same as I did when I stopped being a translator and a proofreader. So she came around and yeah, she definitely came around and it grew on her. And I've had good, really actually surprising when I first started throwing the word out there that people really resonated. So it didn't have that negative connotation at all that I got the pushback for.
I think it's great. So I think it really encapsulates what you just described. Well, I know we're almost out of time, so I want to wrap up with what I call my gratitude question. So I'm a big fan of expressing gratitude, especially publicly, to those who've helped you along the way, especially peers and contemporaries. So if you look around at peers and contemporaries, maybe in your industry, maybe in other business groups or entrepreneurs organization, who would you want to acknowledge publicly?
I think the very first person I would want to acknowledge was the first mentor I had. I was probably around 30-ish. And I applied for this free mentorship program through the city. And the guy who got in touch with me, his name was Jean Crepin, was a really seasoned entrepreneur, big company. And he taught me how to properly read a balance sheet and a P&L. He quoted like so many things that are still in my head. One of the things is it's only hard until you make a decision. So whenever I'm stuck, I think about that. It's like, just make a decision. The most successful people make the highest amount of decisions, because if it's wrong, you make another decision to fix it. But if you don't make a decision, you're always going to be stuck. So that was something that really resonated with me. And he had a massive impact on my life, inspired me to join EO. So that leads me to the next people I'm grateful for. So I'm grateful to Jean. I'm grateful to EO as a whole. And I mean, there's so many members I could touch here. One of them obviously is Connor, who helped me come up with the word offboarding. That was a big one, connecting through the network. Hazel Ortiga. There's a Women of EO group, and she's very active, and her book, Mastery of Miracles and How to Manifest What You Want, had a really massive influence on my life. And then just to name a few others, Marsha Rawls, Winnie Hart, Andrea Houston, Andrea Herrera, all the Women of EO champions. But also so many guys, Vern Harnish, massive influence on me. Yeah, so there's been a lot, and really kind of making the most of that network and gratitude and keeping the connections alive, I think is critically important for the success of yourself and your business.
Great answer, Michèle. Where can people go to check out the book and to check out you and learn more about your coaching and different stuff that you do?
Absolutely. So it's michelehecken.com. Michelle is with one L, Michelehecken. Hecken, like what the heck?
You got to work that into a book title in the future.
Right, exactly. What the heck are you doing? So yeah, michelehecken.com. The book is slated to come out probably mid to late fall. It'll be called The Power of Offboarding, Work Less, Make More, and Live Your Best Life. And you'll find information on the website when we're ready to publish. Reach out if you have any questions.
Michelle, such a pleasure talking to you. Thanks so much.
Thank you for having me, John. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you for listening to the Smart Business Revolution podcast with John Corcoran. Find out more at smartbusinessrevolution.com. And while you're there, sign up for our email list and join the revolution. Revolution. And be listening for the next episode of the Smart Business Revolution podcast.